Local governments in the Western Balkans are striving to achieve greater economic and political independence, and property tax plays a crucial role in this process.
Among all own revenues, property tax is the most significant.
There's a caveat, though.
It's a very hard tax to administer.
In the 90s, Yugoslav successor states and Albania started to transition from socialist to market-oriented economies. This has led to a redistribution of responsibilities between national, municipal, and in some cases regional governments. A stronger role of local governments required that they have financial resources at their disposal. Municipalities had to strengthen their fiscal autonomy and capacity.
And after the dissolution, in fact, of these socialistic states, you didn't have immediately enough strong institutions of the new system to, let's say, impose or to build or to educate or whatever taxpayers for that.
Municipalities in the Western Balkans have gone a long way and increasingly generate their own income.
Own revenues for the municipalities still make less share than the shared revenues. So, but it's depending on the municipality to municipality, because in Serbia they are quite different. But basically, it's on the average it's between 30 and 40% of the total revenues coming from own sources. Within that, the property tax has the most significant role, and it's more, again, depending on municipality to municipality, but it's around 50 to 70% of own revenues. Compared to total revenues, the most significant own revenue as property tax B is around 15% of total revenue. So it's a substantial portion of their revenues.
It may seem like property tax is the best opportunity for municipalities to generate their own income, yet some, if not many, avoid collecting it to the full potential. How can that be? It seems the historical and cultural heritage of the socialist past doesn't always change as fast as the administrative and fiscal systems.
Morality or tax culture. It's logical that in all countries which are in transition, in fact, stopped being socialistic and became, let's say, more capitalistic, but this depends how you define the system. Are not very keen or not very convinced that taxes should be paid. And voluntary compliance is something that needs to be, let's say, built and understood by both sides, by tax administration and taxpayers. Why it's logical? Because in a socialistic period, you haven't have your own property. There is no private property. So, and the taxes are paid in a completely different way. They are mostly companies, and the companies were our companies, etc., etc. So it's a cultural thing.
People should pay taxes. It's been a sense that people should pay taxes to the state, not that and it's the state that's responsible for taxation, not really local governments, with some exceptions. I think, so moving that framework is difficult.
Local governments can avoid further alienating this reluctant and distrustful population by forcing the property tax on them and risking to lose the next elections. This is what happened in Serbia.
There were many taxpayers, mostly people, so voters, natural persons, not enterprises, but private persons, which didn't register for property taxation, and the local governments, because of political opportunism, didn't go for these taxes. If somebody didn't pay the tax, the property tax, there was no penalty, there were no sanctions. And so it was absolutely a non-interest of the citizens in Serbia to pay the property tax to their local communities.
And without sufficient budget, municipalities can't provide high-quality public services to the citizens. What do municipalities do to compensate?
First place they will go is the taxation of business. So you really want to push them to tax the voters, tax the citizens. You squeeze local governments and say, use the property tax to fill all your budget holes. We're not giving you appropriate levels of transfers for other things, for all the social sector functions. We want you to run preschools and social welfare centers on your own. But the only way you're going to pay for that is through the property tax. The odds-on favorite for what's going to happen is that the businesses are going to get squeezed.
In 2013, the Swiss government and the German government started to support the project called Property Tax Reform Program. The initial idea to launch this program was actually because there was a previous program supporting local economic development. And in this context, it was realized that local self-governments in Serbia impose huge taxes, which also change from year to year to private businesses. This was very difficult for private business development on the local level. It harms their development. And in this sense, also reduced opportunities for people in these local communities to find a job.
Property taxes are the domain of local governments. But when we ask experts what hinders property tax collection, they name another surprising factor: the position of the national government.
Rebuilding, or not rebuilding, building of the tax morale and culture, the most important role has the state and the tax administration as central as well local, because the consistent and let's say legal approach and implementation and enforcement, which does not have any exemptions and different treatments, etc., is crucial for the taxpayers to understand it's better to comply voluntarily than within the enforced collection, of course.
And unless local governments, and I think this was, unless national governments do more than say, take it, it's yours, we expect you to support yourself by raising money on this, it's not going to work. So it is also difficult if local governments are being dumped on by the national government, giving more functions than they could possibly finance. And it is also difficult if the national government doesn't recognize that the property tax takes the development of IT systems and valuation systems that ideally should be uniform and which are costly to develop and implement, and that therefore the national government should take some responsibility for helping local governments put those in place.
Anthony Levitas is talking about another major problem of levying property tax: low quality data on taxable property.
Systemic difficulties in registering that property and in valuing that property.
The good news is each of these problems have respective solutions.
What we succeed during the period of time was that, first of all, municipal leadership, the mayors, which reluctant from charging the property tax from their votes because they thought if they have now to pay taxes, they will not vote anymore for them, and that would be the end of their career. They changed their mind because there was a clear positioning of the central government that those municipalities who do not implement the law of property taxation equally to all people, so that everybody has to pay the taxes, and those who do not pay, they have to have sanctions. The mayors changed their behavior and went to collect the property tax. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the national transfers in the full amount. And this was, of course, also monitored by the central government.
The national government also played a role in addressing the second problem, low-quality data on property.
Some signs of success, and one of the things I think the Serbs should be praised for is that the national government undertook concerted efforts to develop a uniform system of property registration and valuation, and undertook a fairly sophisticated campaign of getting municipalities to adopt those technologies and those systems, which meant that valuation could be more uniform, that property registration and the software wasn't an upfront cost for municipalities, and began to overcome some of the resistance and technical difficulties of actually using the property tax.
We worked with 9 municipalities. The municipalities increased their revenues of property tax and also enlarged their database of property to be taxed, because this was one of the other reasons. A lot of property was not registered so far to be taxed, and we helped municipalities with enumerators who went to the field to collect the data of so far unregistered property. Unregistered property, there were entire buildings not registered. There were also certain areas of new built buildings which were not registered in a whole part of a village or a municipality. But there were also many people who increased the square meters of their property. They built an additional floor or 2 or 3 additional floors and didn't register this new square meters with the local authorities, and therefore were not taxed. So we helped them to bring these square meters, unregistered square meters, into the database and to tax them. In one municipality, for example, is just as illustration, Sokobanja, which was one of the 9 first municipalities we supported. They had, in a normal year before our support, 300 new properties registered for property taxation, while a year later, with our support, they had 3,000 new property registered. So it is factor 10 more property registered for taxation, which then had definitively also an impact on their budget. As said, due to the success of the first phase with 9 municipalities, the Swiss government decided to go to scale up the project and enlarge it to 44 Serbian municipalities. After 4 years working with 44 municipalities, we have an additional 100,000 new property in the databases of local self-governments in Serbia to be taxed. Money-wise, the implication is as follows. Before we started the cooperation with those municipalities, the share of property tax in the total municipal budget was between 8 and 9% in average. After now our support provision, we have a share of property tax in the municipal budgets between 11 and 12%.
It's not enough to have a list of all available properties. The value of the properties must be assessed.
For the property tax itself, there are second set of problems, and they are mostly related to the assessment of the tax base. Currently in Serbia, the provisions of the law enable, in fact, local communities to closely estimate the tax base to the market value of the property, because it's said that the municipalities are authorized to estimate the average price of the square meter of the different types of properties within the municipality. And based on that and the square meters of the property, they could calculate the tax base. The problem with that approach, which is improvement comparing to the previous approaches, is that the average price is always the average. So you would have some properties which are more expensive and some properties which are cheaper. Basically, their market price is not really average. Even you may say that it would be, in rare occasions, you would have the market price equal to the average price. So, and there are some attempts and some thoughts how to resolve that problem. And in my opinion, the only possibility, bearing in mind everything, because one of the possibilities also taken in some other countries, is the mass evaluation of the property, which is a big, really big task for the state and could not be done by the local communities. It should be the state initiative and also the activity. And the other way, which is less costly, and because when you have the mass evaluation, you can do it one year and then you have to repeat it, because something which is evaluated 10 years ago is really not close, could not be close to market value. So we were thinking, meaning tax society, how to resolve that. And it could be, when it comes to individuals and also the businesses, the possibility for the taxpayer to assess, to engage, in fact, the authorized appraisal or evaluator of the property, and to submit this within this tax return. How we ended up in that possibility? It's because for certain companies that are taking their books based on the fair value in line with international accounting standards, which in fact means that they are obliged to permanently evaluate their property within 3 years or even annually, depending on the type of the property. The tax base for these companies is the fair value of the property. Fair value is something which is the closest to the market value. And I believe that this possibility could be, in fact, allowed to any taxpayer. Of course, it's not in the books, especially if you are the individual, but there is, let's say, I believe 10 years when the state regulates the evaluator society and the profession. And I believe it's enough time for them to, let's say, have enough experience and codes of conduct within their profession. So they are, in my opinion, able and reliable source of valuation. And how it could work. So the taxpayer may receive the assessment from the local community based on these average prices. And if the taxpayer is basically okay with that assessment, it is not necessary for him or her to engage in valuation and have some additional cost. But if it is not, then the taxpayer could have the chance to have the reliable estimation on their own cost, and then to have the tax base which is closest to the market value. Because basically the property tax is some proxy for the tax on wealth. And tax on wealth should be, let's say, close to the market value of that wealth. Otherwise, it's not really the tax on wealth.
And how can we overcome the cultural resistance to pay the property tax? Alexander believes that if citizens have a say in how their taxes are spent, they will be more willing to pay.
Swiss-supported project, and Switzerland being one of those countries which provides a really a significant possibility for its citizens to participate in local decision making through its local initiatives and referendums. We, of course, as a program in cooperation with our donor, the Swiss government, decided to help municipalities also to include its citizens into decision-making processes. In other words, citizens or taxpayers who pay the property tax and live in the specific municipality should also have a word how this money will be spent, on what are their priorities, and how they want to invest the money additionally generated to property tax. Therefore, our program supports the Serbian government to implement the law on local self-government, which was adopted in 2018, which prescribes that the local self-governments have to ask its citizens before they adopt the new budget on the citizens' opinion. And we support the Serbian government to implement this law, but also our partner municipalities, 44 partner municipalities, to organize citizens' participation and to bring in citizens' opinion and citizens' voice into the local decision making, how they allocate the funds from their budget and what to invest it. This should be, of course, then in line with the citizens' interests for the good of the local development of the development of the local community.
Despite the amazing progress in Serbia, municipalities in Serbia and other Western Balkan countries still have a long way to go before local governments achieve the optimal level of economic independence. Anthony Leviras also believes that property tax is not sufficient to ensure a sufficient flow of income to local governments.
But it's important to recognize that even in the best of cases, the property tax yields 3 to 5%. I mean, best of possible cases yields 3% of GDP in public revenues, and the best of cases is Canada. So there's a certain tension between the current efforts at decentralization, which often look to decentralize social sector functions like education, health, social welfare functions to local governments, and expect local governments to pay for them out of some combination of grants and transfers and own revenues, with the most significant own revenue being the property tax. The problem is that as I said, even in the best of cases, the property tax will not cover social sector expenditure. So there's a certain caution about the property tax as a whole, and putting too much hope in it as a way to resolve the problems of local government finance if the social sector functions are going to be devolved.